They liberated Europe from Nazi tyranny. Millions of American soldiers put their lives on the line for freedom, democracy, and human rights. Ultimately, even the Germans came to see them as liberators. Yet beyond the heroism and the glory, there was also a dark and ugly side. The atrocities were uncontrolled acts of revenge in the heat of combat, most of them never prosecuted, let alone punished. Both sides were willing to shoot POWs, Germans and Americans. The violence was directed against women. Too many soldiers saw them as legitimate booty. Not only on the Eastern Front, in the West as well. In the final stages of the war, the tempest the Germans had unleashed had turned against them. In the wake of the liberating armies, thousands of Germans became victims of atrocities that were cloaked in silence for decades. D-Day, June 6, 1944. Americans and Allied troops hit the beaches of Normandy. It's the greatest amphibious operation ever and the beginning of the end for the Nazis' terror regime in Western Europe. And to this day, a glorious chapter in the history books of Britain's Canadians and Americans. Yet victory comes at a price. The Germans put up a ferocious defense. In hand-to-hand fighting, no quarter is given. A US veteran recalls, "It kill or be killed, yet what if the other guy surrenders?" There are hints that the shooting of prisoners was no isolated event. It takes hours of desperate fighting to cover the few yards from the beaches up to the high ground. It's well afternoon before us officers report the first prisoner taken. The count throughout that day on Omaha Beach rises up to 130. Largest assault zone of operation. Omaha Beach was the largest assault zone of Operation Overlord, a 6-mile stretch which became the battleground for some 40,000 Americans and 7,800 German defenders. When the longest day had ended, roll calls tally only 3,600 Germans still alive. All others are presumed killed or missing in action. Yet the beachhead POWs collecting points were ominously empty. The shooting of prisoners is a clear breach of international conventions, a war crime triggered by military experience thanks behind obstructions. Further inland, some 13,000 Allied airborne troops are literally thrown into the battle, landing by glider or by parachute. Many of them descend directly into the fire of the German guns. As the paratroopers advanced, the sight of dead comrades became grudgingly commonplace. Their survivors are out for revenge. War turns ordinary men into frenzied killers, while their uncontrolled acts of violence by individual American soldiers, some German units resort to systematic murder on explicit orders of the commanding officers. In the church at Grania, men of the Waffen-SS execute 20 wounded US paratroopers and then burn the village down. Yet as the fighting continues, observers also record a mounting ruthlessness among GIS. A war correspondent with the 82nd Airborne Division notes, "Does war automatically loosen all inhibitions? German troops have been violating international law since day one of the war, committing war crimes against millions of soldiers and civilians in occupied countries." American, British and Canadian soldiers had crossed the Channel to crush Hitler's murderous grip on Europe. Along the way, they too would occasionally dispense with the code of proper military procedure. By 1944, the Allies' air offensive is in full swing. Thousands of American and British bombers bring the war back home to Hitler's Germany, the land of the aggressor. City after city is razed to the ground. Hundreds of thousands die, men and women, all people and infants. For some indiscriminate area bombing amounts to a war crime. Historians take a more selective view. The British doctrine of area bombing aimed at forcing the Germans to surrender, yet they fought on right to the bitter end. So was the war against the cities a wasted effort. As absurd as it sounds, by killing hundreds of thousands from the air, the bombers saved countless lives on the battlefields in the cities and in the concentration camps in France. The Allies' breakout from Normandy gathers ever more speed. Their spearheads liberate one French town after another, but losses are high. In that summer of '44, the roads to Paris are lined with burning tanks. Many GIs just don't get it. Why do the Germans fight on? Their overall situation is hopeless, yet their resistance often borders on the fanatical. The ethics of war are eroding on both sides. German prisoners become targets for revenge. Killed by American soldiers, men grew up in a free democratic country, a nation of law and liberty. Pep talks are a common means for commanders to inject their troops with an aggressive spirit. General George S. Patton minced no words in his efforts to turn his men into fighters. When we meet the enemy, we will kill him. We will show no mercy. If you company officers in leading your men against the enemy, he was just a surrender. Oh no, that bastard will die. You will kill him. Stick him between the third and fourth ribs. You will tell your men that they must have the killer instinct. We will get the names of killers, and killers are immortal. John Fake from the 11th Armored Division recalls a similar incident during the Battle of the Bulge in Belgium. As we were going up the hill out of town, I know some of our boys were lining up German prisoners in the fields on both sides of the road. There must have been 25 or 30 German boys in each group. Machine guns were being set up. These boys were to be machine gunned, and more were committing the same crimes we were now accusing the Japs and Germans of doing. U.S. military justice very rarely followed up on such incidents. 3.5 million GI saw service in Europe during the war. During this period, the U.S. Army Judge Advocate General filed but 2 proceedings dealing with killing prisoners of war. In both cases, the defendants were acquitted. Allied Supreme Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower, however, is intent on probing the rumors about prisoners being shot. He orders an investigation that covers all U.S. units in Europe. Besides regular German army units, the Americans face ever more formations of the Waffen-SS. Their men are notorious for their cruelty on the battlefield, and for outrageous massacres among the civil population, like a NORAD or a French village where members of the SS Division Das Reich had murdered more than 600 old men, women, and children. Violations of the rules of war. Columns of German prisoners have screened deliberately from members of the Waffen-SS. Once picked out, they're often targeted for harsh treatment, much more than their regular army comrades. Many of them are veterans of the Eastern Front, a battleground where violations of the rules of war were common practice. In 1944, the dimension of atrocities of the war in the East was still beyond the imagination of most GIS fighting in France. For 3 years since June 1941, fighting had raged out of all proportion. The death toll among Soviet citizens would rise to 20 million. Declared subhuman by the Germans, more than 2.5 million Red Army soldiers died as POWs under the eyes of their captors. Hitler's regime condones or even orders murder on the Eastern Front. You may loot, rape, or kill at will without having to face a court-martial. It's a war of extinction with no holds barred. Liberation at last. Combat in the West runs along more civilized lines, but for some it is the license to indulge their baser instincts. Liberation at last in Paris. American troops are being cheered by grateful crowds, for years of German occupation are finally over. Flowers for the liberators symbolize joyous reception, yet some soldiers view the girls and women along the roads of victory as their fair share in the spoils of war. It's the age-old attitude of the conqueror, and it doesn't matter if the woman is French or German. Most of the victims keep silent about what happened to them out of fear of shame, or just to be able to go on in the struggle to survive. Many of them confide their experiences to their diaries, but the trauma will stay with them throughout their lives. especially since they have no one to turn to. The family must not know. For most of the Allied soldiers preparing for the invasion, be the Americans, Britons or Canadians, the continent is a land of high expectations. Sexual assaults on civilians. Desertion of France's Asia, a Hota Chevel's title song Among the Stars and Stripes. The American Forces daily newspaper even offered some helpful lines in French. You are a beautiful girl, or more directly, may I take you home? If this didn't work, some would resort to violence. So were sexual assaults on civilians isolated incidents were a mass phenomenon. In April 1945, American troops entered Bavaria. The parish reports give a detailed picture of their advance, and for once provide reliable figures concerning rapes. Each local parish priest was obliged to submit a summing up to its diocese about what had happened after the armies, the Yanks in colloquial German, had come. On April 30, 1945, American units reached Munich. The city is in chaos. A young woman is assaulted by a GI in broad daylight. Hundreds of thousands of Germans are on the move. Who is Ola Herr King? A 33-year-old actress is trekking from Prague to her hometown in Bavaria. In her autobiography published in 1973, she related how she was raped by 3 American soldiers. Hiding the disgrace from family. If the victims get pregnant, there's no way of hiding the disgrace from family or husband. Rape is anything but a trivial offense in U.S. military law. Once an incident has been reported, the accused are tried by a court-martial. The rate of convictions is particularly high among African American soldiers. Verdicts of guilty against Caucasian GIs are few and far between. Stories of ever more cases of rape reached the home front. Time magazine quotes a GI to the effect that in the eyes of their allies, the US Army had become an army of rapists. The fact that Red Army soldiers raped countless German women was widely reported, especially in post-war Germany. The topic of sexual violence committed by Americans was largely avoided so as not to embarrass the new ally of the Cold War. A survey of JAG files amounts to comparatively few cases. 182 rapes in France, 552 in Germany. Yet these files merely cover incidents that were brought to trial. For the first time, a historian has tried to estimate the number of rapes based on the number of war children registered in the occupation zones of all 4 former allies. According to Miriam Jefford's estimate, there would have been 45,000 rapes committed by British soldiers, 50,000 by French troops, 190,000 by GIS, and 430,000 by Red Army soldiers. Men in uniform and the women of the vanquished. An aspect of World War II which had long been passed over in silence and more or less ignored by historians. SS Chief Heinrich Himmler estimated the number of children sired by German soldiers on the Eastern Front at about 1 million and issued orders to abduct these children to the right. The advance of the Red Army and the ensuing collapse of German logistics and wanton destruction while retreating prevented the order from being carried out. Sexual assaults by Soviet soldiers became a recurring theme in post-war West Germany. Similar acts by their Western counterparts received little coverage. Nam, Munich, April 30, 1945. The 34-year-old widow of a German soldier is supposed to have been raped by a U.S. Army officer. At the trial, the perpetrator states in his defense that that afternoon he had gone to Dachau concentration camp and witnessed the full amount of German atrocities, and in light of this pleads guilty on a minor charge. At Dachau, the GIs get a first-hand look at the extent of the crimes committed by Germans against political opponents, Jews, Soviet POWs, and nationals from occupied countries. Among the heaps of bodies are some 30,000 survivors. Many of them little more than walking corpses. Effort of resistance. When the first infantry patrols reached the camp, SS guards opened fire in a token effort of resistance. The GIS are in no mood to stick to the rules. Take no prisoners here, let's kill every one of these bastards, don't take any SS alive, take no prisoners here. When the brief firefight is over, the full horror of the camp becomes apparent. Surviving SS men are lined up against a camp wall when the machine guns fall silent. About 30 of them lie dead where they stood. Strictly speaking, it's a war crime. Even the accessories to annihilation on an unheard-of scale are entitled to legal procedures. Yet camp inmates as well as the U.S. Army top brass sympathized with the soldiers' act of self-justice. On orders of General Patton, by then appointed military governor of Bavaria, Charges against the men involved were dismissed. In April, 45 British troops liberated the concentration camp in Bergen-Belsen, and her face with the same horrifying views as the Americans at Dachau, images that outstretched any imagination. The guards are rounded up just like a taco, yet there's no self-administered justice. 3 SS men are shot trying to escape. All others are taken prisoner and forced to help bury the masses of corpses. 3.5 months later, 45 of them were put on trial as war criminals. Thousands of German POWs were treated after surrendering to the Western Allies during the final weeks of the war. In the recollections, some US veterans speak quite freely of having shot German POWs. There is no equivalent in British war. Wholesale punishment for their crime. As the war draws to a close, there is a mounting conviction among the US military that the Germans deserve wholesale punishment for their crimes. A harsh treatment of POWs is considered to be an appropriate means to purge their minds from the demons of Nazi ideology. In all, 19 camps are set up on the meadows along the Rhine. Outdoors with no shelters, there are no installations to wash, no blankets. Behind the barbed wire of the so-called temporary enclosures, over 1 million German soldiers, now termed disarmed enemy forces, are waiting to be released. Among them Rudolf Rankin, a master sergeant of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. When his unit surrenders to the Americans, the men are surprised that the GIS seem to have a penchant for depriving the Germans of their valuables. A few months before war broke out, Franke had married his childhood sweetheart Martha. Back home in a small town near Dresden, now like thousands of others in his camp, he hopes that he will be allowed to head home soon. Their US Army guards have problems of their own. Conditions in the camps are abysmal. There's no sanitation, and hardly any medical care. International law states that POWs are entitled to the same provisions as their captors. Inside the Rhine Meadow camps, it's a far cry from that. There's 1K ration for every 4 prisoners by the victors, simply overwhelmed by the enormous number of POWs. Death soon takes its toll. Thousands fall victim to starvation diseases with the bullets of a guard. There was this kid who tried to get out under the fence and got stuck, and that American, I'll never forget the image he takes of his gun. The kid just cried out "Mama," then he was dead. Shooter died, he was nearly dead anyway. Unthinkable. Usually incidents like this generally were passed over without any investigation. And for sport, they sometimes would fire at night at about waist height because of our propaganda that all Germans are Nazis, all Germans are anti-Semites, all Germans are bad people, in short, and they deserve whatever punishment they get. That was the attitude. Violations of international conventions concerning the treatment of POWs would occur on all sides. The scale of overall statistics is tipped heavily to one side. 21,000 German soldiers died in British captivity, 22,000 in American enclosures, more than 350,000 in Soviet camps. The figure of Red Army soldiers who perished in German captivity surpasses 2.5 million. Compared to the German policy of deliberate extermination, individual acts of violence and revenge by American GIs are akin to marginal episodes. They fought what has been termed the last good war, but even good wars have their dark moments. In September 1945, the Rhine Meadow camps opened their gates. Millions of German POWs can return home to a country that had yet to learn to view the victors as liberators. A decade on the vanquished had turned into a friend and an ally, and would prefer not to have that image tarnished. The ancient Romans said, in times of war, laws fall silent. 70 years and several wars in the USA is still reluctant to let their soldiers be judged according to international laws and conventions. The horrors inflicted upon these women are a stark reminder of the brutality of war. It's a painful chapter in history that must never be forgotten. By sharing these stories, we honor their memory and demand justice. Let's work together to prevent such atrocities from ever happening again. Please like, share, and subscribe to support our mission of raising awareness about historical injustices. Your support helps us continue to tell these important stories. Thank you for watching.